When award-winning author and journalist Megan Norris turns her attention to a story, we know the results will be thorough and compassionate. Megan's latest investigation can be heard on the podcast Somebody's Daughter. It's about the far-reaching conspiracy to remove and traffic the babies of Australian women deemed unworthy of parenthood, right up until the 1980s. We spoke to one of these women in episode 263 of Australian True Crime, which we're reissuing this week. And Megan Norris joins us on this episode to talk about what she learned from meeting many women who lived through similar circumstances. This is Australian True Crime. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is created, the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation.
Well, it's a change of direction because nobody dies for a change. In my books, there is no morgue, there is no autopsy, they're not dead. But the suffering is sort of like that. And I'm seeing a big similarity between the families of murdered children, as you would know with your work, when you talk to people and they talk about this endless grief, that no matter what, where journalists ask that stupid $1 million question outside court when they jam a microphone in your face and say, has this brought you closure? Has this sentence brought you closure? And I'm thinking, of course it hasn't. I would never ask that question. I've learned never to ask that question. But for these women, it's a pathological aggravated grief of a crime without ending.
And a crime without recognition as well.
Ordinary women. They were just regular women. What they had in common? They were young, they were unmarried, and they were vulnerable. When I mentioned at first that I was working on forced adoption stuff, people said, the Indigenous.
Yeah, stolen generations, yeah.
And let's be clear, there are a lot of First Nations women, mothers, whose babies were definitely taken.
Well, what this show brings our attention to, I think, is this systemic belief in stealing people's babies, in this kind of moral imperative to steal people's babies, whether they be First Nations people or whether they be young women who were deemed immoral for having dared to have sex and fall pregnant. We have a history of removing people's babies. It's really breathtaking when you think about it.
It was a shock to me because I'd gone to this little writing group on the Gold Coast. I wasn't supposed to have gone. I thought I could do with a break from my laptop. And I just wanted to hang out with other people who were writing and sort of maybe make some friends because it's quite lonely just sitting here writing. And I remember this elderly woman standing up. They go around the room and say, what are you working on? Everyone was working on something or other. And she stood up and said, I'm working on a memoir that I started thumping out on a typewriter 30-odd years earlier. And it's about my stolen baby. So I thought kidnap, like abduction. And she said, I'm one of 150,000 Australian women whose babies were systematically stolen from hospitals and maternity homes all around the country between 1950 and 1989, which totally took my breath away. My boys were born in 83 and 85. And I was gobsmacked. And she said, oh, yeah, and this was worldwide. So another 140,000 babies in New Zealand. Another, I think it's 60,000 babies in Scotland and England. Nobody knows the number in Ireland because a lot of those little babies didn't even survive. But here it was seen as an instant and available supply of newborns for childless couples. And there were so many after the war because a lot of guys came home from war with a dose of an STD, which made them infertile, which they blamed on mumps. And there was mumps around then. But they came back from war with these chlamydias and different diseases that they then gave their wives and both became infertile.
Wow, that's so fascinating. This is what I love about your research is I thought I knew a little bit about this. I'd spoken to this lady that you're talking about, Lily, the first lady that you met, spoken to her about her story before, but you've just gone to so many other places with this, the context, which is what I'm always looking for. Also, I've heard other people talk about this sort of YOLO attitude during wartime, that people will sometimes act in ways that they wouldn't normally because there is this sense of impending doom. There is this sense of we don't know if there's a tomorrow.
Yeah.
So young men and women here in Australia, were entering into sexual relationships where they previously hadn't.
They were, and I think people misunderstand it. There's a little bit of truth in the fact that it was the social sort of conditioning of the time, that it was frowned upon. Illegitimacy was a real stain on society. That was just an excuse, I think. The more I dig into it, the more I think that was just a very convenient justification for taking people's babies, because what it was actually about was actually put into motion by the Marriage Guidance Council. Because there was all this infertility, there were unhappy families and marriage breakdowns and potential divorce, and that was frowned upon. They come up with a new plan, like, what do we do to heal these damaged couples that might get divorced? How about we figure out a way where we can help them have a nuclear family and keep them out of the divorce courts, keep those families together and build the new country across the Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And we keep them together by stealing other people's kids.
And I suppose thinking we're solving two problems here, because we've got these young women who are pregnant, that's immoral, rather than invest in education or in support for those women, because it was called the single mother's pension when it was first introduced. It wasn't introduced till the 70s, was it?
Well, it had a different name, which they made sure it had, and they didn't tell anyone about it.
Right.
So it was like a really great secret. It came under the widow's pension for war widows. A lot of people lost their young hubbies in the war, but they made sure you weren't told. So that was the whole thing with adoption. And the adoption laws were quite clear that children for adoption, mother had to consent. Well, that went out the window with forced adoption.
We'll get into that.
They had to be consenting. They had to be supposedly informed of their rights. Well, options, alternatives that would allow them to keep their new baby. But they weren't. They weren't told anything like that. They weren't told that there was money available. And no one had heard of single mothers' benefit.
No one had heard of single mothers, Megan.
Well, they made sure that no one did. So they brought into effect, basically, it was social workers. It was like one massive collusion between doctors, hospitals, nurses, social workers, and children's service departments all across the country. And they've sort of done this thing since where they go, well, it wasn't the federal government's fault because each state was responsible for those babies. But the federal government sanctioned it, and the federal government knew that it was happening, and it was happening across the Commonwealth every single day.
You make a lot of great points in the very first episode of this podcast, Somebody's Daughter. It's such a good episode. You and your co-host Moira sort of setting us up, educating us, talking us through lots of context again so that we can then hear the women's stories with that context. One of the points you make is that there isn't the religious element that I certainly have always thought of. But I was raised Catholic. I had a great aunt who went through the Magdalene laundries, had a baby.
Now to the story of the Irish asylums named for Mary Magdalene, traditionally thought to be the repentant prostitute in the Gospel of St. Luke. These asylums, which forced thousands of young women into slave labor, are a dark chapter in the history of the Catholic Church.
No one knew about it until this baby, this woman, appeared 50 years later. So I always thought of it as a Catholic thing, that young Catholic girls were at most risk of this system. But you make the point that was not the case.
It was not. And that's really interesting because when I've mentioned to people what I'm working on, they would say, Catholic Church, straight away. Most people will say that, first of all, they say, it's Indigenous babies, stolen generation. Or they say it's the Catholic Church. Well, yes and no. It was every church. It was the Anglican Church. It was the Jewish organisation in Melbourne, the Jewish charity. It was like a benevolent organisation, Salvation Army. It was across the board. And it was like conditioning of everybody. And it all goes back to the Marriage Guidance Council, who had this master plan of setting up infertility clinics at hospitals next to the maternity section. So they would earmark babies from the first prenatal visit. So the minute a young mum comes in, one of the first questions they would ask is, are you married? Oh no, but we're engaged and we're getting married. And a lot of people were engaged and getting married. It made no difference. That file was immediately marked baby for adoption. Immediately, without them being told. So they had no idea their babies were being marked for adoption at the first prenatal visit. So they're collecting bassinets and clothes and thinking they're going to take this baby home, and they're not told. And they're not even told when they go into hospital to have them. And that was across the board. So, I've read, there are like 400 submissions. I reckon I've read nearly every one of them now. And at one stage I started just plucking randomly out and reading different submissions to the parliamentary inquiry in 2011 into forced adoption practices.
What a devastating read.
I know. And once I started, it was ghastly. It was ghastly that I just couldn't stop reading. And I'd think, I'll just read half a dozen more. And then just half a dozen more. It became addictive bedtime reading. And I think for me, it reminded me of even what the Nazis, because the Nazis were trialling some of these drugs in the concentration camp at Auschwitz. So, they're all racing to patent this drug that would dry up milk.
These young women, girls, were oftentimes on mind-bending medications. When they're being asked to sign documents, they don't know what the documents are. But also, this medication had terrible physiological effects on them and their babies.
Carcinogenic.
Yeah.
And they knew it. And the health department here knew it as early as 1970. They knew it. And they carried on giving it in overdose. And there is no legal safe dose for this. That's the whole point. So this, to me, was reading the birthing experience. For me, it was the systematic, carefully orchestrated plan, this big collusion, the big lie, that everyone was in on but mum, but the expectant mum.
Oh, it makes me sick to my stomach. These women, one woman talks about realising much later that there'd been all these meetings going on behind her back between her family, the father's family, the medical people.
Yeah.
It honestly makes me sick to my stomach to realise that. You talk about one woman who was told that her baby died. She woke up.
One of many.
Right. However long after going to hospital, she was knocked out the minute she got there. She wakes up days later and they say, sorry, it died. And it didn't.
That's a whole other subject that I'm looking into too. But the dead babies, back from the dead, they never died. They weren't stillborn, but they were. Some women were told that their babies were stillborn. Only for 35 years later, for some young guy to turn up on the doorstep and say, did you have a baby at Crown Street Hospital in Sydney, the most notorious place in Australia? Did you have a baby in such and such? Yes, I'm that baby. And she's devastated, but I was told the baby had died. That is not unusual. That is a story I keep hearing. But what I read when I was going through the research, because you wonder how, I was like, but how did it happen? How could they get away with it? How? And when you look at it, I found a speech that a very well-known obstetrician gave in Melbourne to a group of very prominent obstetricians around the country. It's like a convention of obstetricians and nurses. And in it, he said, don't worry about the law. Don't worry about the law, because they were breaking the law and they knew they were breaking the law. Don't bother yourself with the law, because these women, I think he likened them to chimpanzees or something. They're poorly educated. They're like the dregs of the earth. They don't know how to raise a baby. They're unfit. And so you're doing that baby a favour. So that myth was perpetuated. It's better for baby. And that was used as a big form of manipulation and coercion for these poor, vulnerable young mums. And let's face it, we're all vulnerable when we have babies.
Oh, absolutely. I was 37 and I was pretty vulnerable, yeah.
And they hit you at your lowest and say, now don't be such a selfish girl. I've got a beautiful family waiting for this baby, and they're going to give this baby a great education, a private education, beautiful home. That wasn't true. A lot of those adoptees were abused. They went to very old couples infertile couples that couldn't have kids, that really, when they were formally adopting, child services would have turned them down because they're too old. So they do private adoptions. So people were selling babies for 50 quid a pop.
That's what I was wondering at the beginning of our conversation. I thought, surely someone's making money out of this, because I don't see any conspiracy of this size that anyone would invest the time and energy in unless people were making money.
They were making money, because I found a tiny newspaper cutting from about 1972 in The Truth, or I think it might have been Brisbane Courier Mail, certainly in The Truth, talking about where an MP in Brisbane was expressing concerns about a very well-known local home for young unmarried mothers where the matron was suspected of, he said basically it was a system that was open to financial exploitation, and he'd heard rumours. Well, later that was proven to be true. So years later when this matron died, and she was at St Mary's Home for Girls in Brisbane. She was the matron of a home. She was actually organising private adoptions, and when she died, they found a suitcase under her bed full of all these little snapshots, black and white snapshots of all the babies that she'd organised private adoptions for. And I found a letter. I was in possession of a letter from a lady who had adopted and taken the child through that matron, had organised the private adoption. The couple lived in Papua New Guinea, which was part of the territory, part of Australia then, and babies were not allowed. If you were born in Queensland, you had to stay in Queensland. So that she had some interstate trafficking racket going where she was flogging babies for £50 a time. And what she was saying was to the, this was a well-off home for well-off Brisbaneites, and their daughters, they were like solicitors' daughters and things, went to this home. She was charging the parents to keep the girls at the home. Then she was hiring the girls out as nannies, which is ironic, nannies to other doctors and notables, but they were not fit to have their own babies, but they could mind other people's, and domestics, and making money that way from them. And then she was telling the prospective adopted parents, I'm going to need some money from you to cover medical expenses in cash. So it's £50 in cash. So she was selling those babies for £50 a time.
And trafficking them, as you say, trafficking them internationally, or at least interstate at that stage. I'm sort of shocked to hear that there were laws around it, but they were just ignored. You make the point that there was a law. I suppose this is where the federal government thinks it might have a way around it by saying, well, we had laws and people broke them. That you said that young women, young mothers were supposed to be given a grace period of 5 days after the birth of their baby.
Before they were even approached. You couldn't even raise the word adoption with a mother within the first 5 days. But those babies in that particular home in Brisbane, they were signing their babies away at 4 months pregnant, which is strictly not allowed.
Well, they wouldn't have known, would they? The girls wouldn't have known.
No. And the shame from the families was, we'll hide you away and stay there till it's all over and don't you dare come out. And they were kept in that home, and they were allowed out in the early stage of the pregnancy to go for a walk to the shop. But they were not allowed out when they were showing, because of the shame. They had to stay. Lily describes in her book, Prisoner of the State, she describes in that book how she was at the Catholic Magdalene home in Wooloowin in Brisbane, and she describes how they all went to mass at 4 a.m. They were dragged out of bed by one of the nuns and marched off in the freezing cold. They all had to wear white shifts and thongs, even in the winter, in this old Victorian former asylum. And they were marched off to mass, but they were not allowed into the church where the righteous congregation sat. They were ushered in through a back door and sat behind a screen. And I just thought, how ironic. I wrote the foreword to Lily's book, and reading that, it was like, hang on, she went into labour at mass in front of the Holy Virgin, herself a single mother.
Yes, yep.
And she goes into labour in mass where she gets up and there's blood all over this white shift. And I've got this horror image of that, kept me awake for nights. And she's ushered out because of the shame, sent into a side office, packed off to hospital to have this baby, but not knowing she wasn't going to be bringing that baby home.
Yeah, still not knowing.
But the shame, the shaming, like, we'll lock you away. I've got mums who appeared on the podcast who talked about being locked in their bedroom for the whole pregnancy.
I know that one lady said they had family over for Christmas and she was locked in her bedroom and not allowed to come out. And they just said she wasn't there. She's not home.
She wasn't there. And another girl at the private home I mentioned in Brisbane talked about being so hungry because they were worked and worked and worked. Some of the girls described their hair falling out, the teeth falling out, being forced to scrub floors later in pregnancy, and being forced to scrub floors like within days of giving birth in difficult circumstances. They were treated shamefully, and they were told they were the devil's spawn. this child is the spawn of the devil, you evil woman. But you know that the articles in the newspapers of the day, everything was like social conditioning. I found an article in The Truth which described some stupid politician or social worker came up with some idea that they should ban young men from taking young women in their cars because the cars were an instrument of evil, because that's where these crafty young women were trapping good young men with good jobs and cars into having sex with them so they could snare themselves a husband with a car. And it was actually the other way around. Very, very few of those men were ever charged with carnal knowledge.
Plus, more than one woman that you talk about, I'm sure there are many, many, were in good relationships, loving relationships with men, planning to get married, in some cases living with men.
Living with them.
Who were supportive and loving and ready to have babies with them, but because they were under 17, they were arrested. This one lady was that Lily?
Lily was arrested.
Lily was arrested because she was in danger of...
Moral danger. She was exposed to moral danger.
She was a month away from turning 17 where they couldn't have arrested her. I mean, it's just nonsensical. No, it doesn't add up.
Well, it was nonsensical altogether because the age of consent in Queensland in 1967, when Lily was arrested, was 16.
Well, there you go.
3 weeks off her 17th birthday, and 2 police turn up on her doorstep at night. And she's got morning sickness, drag her out of bed. And she said, she thought the neighbours were complaining about her boyfriend's band practice. And they'd come to get her, and she was thrown in the lockup in Brisbane. And actually, the sergeant on the desk that night said to the 2 police who arrested her, "You could get me hung for this, bringing her in here. Why are you bringing her in here? Isn't there somewhere else she can go?" And they were like, "No, she's living in sin." So she's shoved into the lockup where all the drunks and everything are, terrified, throwing up all night, taken before the children's court and made a ward of the state. But of course she was, because then they own her, and her unborn baby was on their radar.
If you'd like to talk to someone about abuse that's taken place in your life, no matter how long ago it happened, your GP is always a good place to start. If that's not going to work for you, you can contact 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732 or via their website 1800respect.org.au. Or you can call Lifeline's 24-hour phone counselling service on 13 11 14.
It's interesting too, you mentioned a minute ago that this one home you were talking about in Brisbane was for the daughters of wealthy families to go. So there was no safety in
Nowhere.
Socioeconomic status, even if your dad was rich.
Oh, it's even worse. In some respects,
Right.
It was even worse. So it was private hospitals, private mothers and babies' homes. So that was a private mother and baby home where Matron McGregor ruled with a fist of iron. And one of the people I spoke to, one of the young mums who had been 15, 14 at the time that she was at that home, remembers being so hungry she broke out of her bedroom window and ran down the road and bought a chocolate bar. And when she came back, Matron McGregor was waiting with a bottle of castor oil, forced her to drink a cup of castor oil, which sent her into immediate premature labour.
Yeah. I've heard of women drinking that when they want to bring on labour.
Well, she went to the hospital, was rushed to hospital in an ambulance, where they said, "Did you come from Matron McGregor?" Like they knew, because she was known for doing that. But the shaming, being told they had to hide. And that's what keeps people silent.
Well, the thing for me is realising that our society is full of these women who are still shamed to a certain degree. I'm sure, because the trauma of that isn't going to leave you easily. These women are victims of this horrible abuse and they're still quiet about it. We don't know them. We don't know this about them.
That's the truth. And adoptees too. And so I think what people don't realise, Dr. Geoffrey Rickaby, who was a very prominent Sydney psychiatrist, started off counselling adoptees who were having identity issues in their teens. Like, who am I really? And they were told, a lot of parents were told, adopted parents, do not tell them that they're adopted. Do not tell them. So they didn't tell anyone that their children were adopted. There was a shame associated, a stigma with that too, because it was the sort of ongoing stigma of illegitimacy. And one mum describes when she was a little girl, when she was pregnant, first thing her mother did, a crazy Baptist, like obsessed Baptist, fanatical, beat her with a double leather strap that you sharpen knives with, beat her senseless for being pregnant and said she was possessed by the devil, treated her like that all the time. Now that little girl had already been adopted herself, so she was told all her life by this crazy mother that she was the devil's spawn, and then she gets pregnant herself. Well, it's in your genes, but she was told her mother had died in a car accident or plane crash or something. In actual fact, then she's saying, you're just like your mother. How do you know I'm like my mother? I don't know who my mother is. So there's this, it becomes intergenerational. So 1st of September is the anniversary of the birthday of Lily's stolen son. She goes back to that place.
Yeah.
All over again. That loss is ongoing. She looks at photos of him as a little baby in a christening gown in the arms of a stranger. Her son that she really wanted. She wanted that baby. She was getting married. This was all her dreams gone. And she looks at these pictures of this little boy growing up. And these are milestones that should have been hers. So you grieve that. Geoffrey Rickaby describes it as a pathological aggravated grief. If you think about it, it's a forever grief. But then the child goes on to not know his heritage, and he has a family who don't know their heritage. Lily's got grandchildren now that she's only met very recently. She went on to have another daughter. She's got those grandchildren, but then she's got a whole other family. This all grew out of my meeting with Lily at that writing group. And I wrote a story for Woman's Weekly at the time, and that was a front cover story. She still says to this day she shared the front cover with the late Queen. Like it's the highlight of her life because she's a royalist.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
And then I wrote a different kind of story last October, which appeared on the front cover of Good Weekend. But that was looking at the bigger picture because by then I'd got my teeth into it and I just couldn't stop. And after the story came out in Good Weekend, this guy came up to me in the shopping centre, a big burly guy with tattoos, and he came up to me and he said, "Did you write that story?" Someone in the cafe said, "You'd written that story?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm adopted." And he said, "I was fortunate. I had a beautiful upbringing." And he's got a younger brother who was adopted from a different mother. And he said, "Years later, I tracked my mother down in Adelaide and she was so pleased to meet me, but she had a whole other family." And she said she'd been filled with such shame. She couldn't tell her family about him. And when she died, he couldn't go and say goodbye because he was her secret.
Still
To her deathbed. And he's never contacted, out of respect for his mum, never contacted his siblings. After Lily, I started to run memoir writing workshops. Because other women were so proud of Lily's achievement writing her book. They all had stories to tell. So I started to run these courses for Origins, which is the support organisation that Lily is the CEO for. As a result of those workshops, all these women started sharing. We do a bit of writing, a bit of technique and a lot of talking and a lot of therapy really, because they say, I've never told anyone this before. And sometimes the stories that they tell, they've never told a living soul.
Well, you and I both know that talking about difficult things is hard for people. Like I meet all the time victims of crime or families of victims of crime who'll say, it's so good to just get it out, to just tell the whole story because nobody really wants to listen. It makes people feel so uncomfortable. No one knows what to say. So this, I guess, is similar to that, but with this added shame.
Totally. Because they were treated shamefully. The nurses treated them shamefully because they were told to. So they had this philosophy called clean break philosophy. And the clean break philosophy was considered, according to these psychiatrists or these obstetricians that were conditioning all their staff to do the same. It was told to teach them a lesson, basically. Clean break, don't talk about the baby, don't mention the baby, don't acknowledge the pregnancy. So Lily and others like her would describe going to prenatal visits. That's the only time some of those women went out. They went to a prenatal visit with the doctor who did not speak to them. They would listen to the baby's heartbeat. They'd measure all was good with baby. No one spoke to them. They'd be handed a urine container, go and give a sample. They weren't called by their real names. So, for example, Lily, and this was common, when she was admitted to the home she was admitted to at the Magdalene home, changed her name straight away. So she became Leanne, fed into the system, haircut, all the same, put in a white shift, all the same. They become anonymous like prisoners. And they are prisoners because they can't leave. Every single illegitimate birth by law in Queensland had to be reported to the Department of Children's Services. So you couldn't leave the state. So you couldn't nick off and go to New South Wales because you would be arrested and brought back because it was an offence not to register that birth.
And again, an offence for the woman, not for the father of the baby.
For the woman. And a lot of fathers who wanted to see their babies. One woman told me they were 21, they were getting married. He went to the hospital to see his new baby and the baby had been taken off her. And she's saying, what did I have? Never you mind. You know, the baby was taken, they were hidden in other parts of the hospitals, in locked wards. He found his daughter. He went looking for her. He found her in a private room with a nurse on guard. And when he tried to barge into the room to see his baby, the nurse said, I'll have security called and have you removed and we'll charge you. You will be charged. On a few of the submissions that I read, a few grandparents really dug in and went to the hospital asking to see the baby, and they were turned away. A few that really put up a fight, made such a fuss and threatened to get solicitors, the baby went home with mum.
It's so hard to believe. It sounds like Handmaid's Tale stuff. And I mean,
doesn't it?
You know, Margaret Atwood makes the point that she didn't write anything in those books that hasn't actually happened or isn't happening somewhere in the world. So it's so hard to really conceptualise how recently this was happening, right?
1989. My children were in primary school then. It could have been me. You think it's impossible. And the trouble now is you've got another generation that will say, which makes them feel worse, well, why didn't you just walk out the door?
Yeah.
Well, you could walk out the door, but your baby was in a locked ward, God knows where, you didn't know where. And also, you were absolutely scrambled on psychotic drugs. And for the few medical reports that I was able to find, I found this medical report for this one young girl. She put up such a fight. She really wanted her baby. The more she complained, the more they upped the drugs, till she was absolutely out of her head.
And they were well practiced as well. Every individual girl who goes through this process, it's her first time. It's all shocking. They don't understand what's happening a lot of the time. And they're up against this force, aren't they? This conspiracy that's very well trained in what they're doing.
Well, it was just carefully planned. So they would, and Lily took the state to court years later. She wanted justice. She did a legal degree and she was very brave. She took the state of Queensland to court and the Catholic Church. And her lawyer said, what, we're taking everybody on? Yes, she was. Anyway, the Catholic Church settled the home because she was arguing slave labour.
Yeah.
She was kept there for the whole pregnancy, working in a commercial steam laundry for free. So she argued she wanted her wages, but she also argued that she was abused as a prisoner of the state because she was made a ward of the state. And she lost the battle, but she won the war because even though she lost that case, it brought out, because she thought she was the only one, it brings out all these other women out of the woodwork. So many women said to me, I thought it was just me.
Again, we take for granted the knowledge we have now of this system, even though I'm learning I didn't have as much as I thought I did. But yeah, now we think, oh yeah, this laundries existed and all that. But every individual girl thought she was just the one worst in the world.
And they were kicked out after, saying, now don't you tell anyone what happened here. Do not mention the baby because no decent man will want to marry second-hand goods. That was absolutely drummed into them. One girl was told, go on, you can always go and have another baby. Go down the drive-in, get yourself pregnant again, get yourself knocked up again, you'll be back. That was the attitude.
But then the other attitude that you talk about is medical people being quite open about the fact that they needed to make the experience rough to prevent them coming back, to teach them a lesson.
I've found in one statement, one young obstetrician, a very young obstetrician at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, asked a senior guy, look, she's really suffering. What, should I give her more drugs? It's like, no, let her suffer. Let her sweat it out. She got herself here. And, another lady I spoke to remembers going into a hospital in regional Queensland. And she said what she was told, when she was crying in heavy labour. And the nurse came and said, shut up. Stop it. You are waking the married mothers. And she wasn't given any pain relief or anything. She didn't know what was happening to her. And she was carted off. They were cut to ribbons, a lot of them. One young woman describes being in heavy labour and hearing the nurse, the midwife, on the phone to the doctor saying, I've got this girl here having a baby and he's taking his time and we want to go to the spring doctors and nurses ball. We're running late for that ball. And he said, who is she? Is a family around? And they said, no, she's one of the sluts from downstairs. And he said, okay, shove her on a pethidine drip, leave her overnight, come back in the morning. When they came back in the morning, she developed sepsis and the baby was critical. And basically, she was told, if she didn't toe the line and shut up, they'd put the baby in a corner in the crib and let him die. And the grief, one lady I spoke to in Adelaide, it really upset me. And she was the most lovely lady and she talked about this delivery that she had. And she's now agoraphobic. She later in life developed breast cancer. She'd had that drug, diethylbistro, and she was given it whilst her baby was still attached to the placenta. She was given a huge dose in the arm by injection and then dosed on the stuff. She had her medical records. But the baby is cross-placental, that drug, and she was given a huge dose of it. She eventually tracked the baby down years later as a grown-up 24-year-old, and he died of brain cancer. And she said, he was attached to the umbilical cord. He was still attached to the placenta when I was given that. She later developed breast cancer, but she didn't trust hospitals. Yeah. And she wouldn't go out. We were going to have to do the interview in her bedroom, but then it all got too much, just talking about it and reliving it. So it's that intergenerational crime, it's like it just never goes. I spoke with Professor Naim Mushin, the Honourable Professor Naim Mushin, former Australian Family Court Justice of many years, and he was appointed by the Attorney General Nicola Roxon to be the chairman of the steering group that he personally collected 400 submissions from women, from adoptees, from fathers, from grandparents all around Australia for the parliamentary inquiry that led to the national apology in 2012. He said the stories were so disturbing. And for him, as an ethics professor at Monash, as a former lawyer, turned judge, I said, what did you find? What did you find the most disturbing as a lawyer? He said, the lack of informed consent. A lot of these girls were incest victims, rape victims. Most, I'd say the majority, were young girls in love, first relationships. They weren't promiscuous. That was a myth about their sexuality to sort of justify treating them so badly. But he said the way they were denied things, they were denied pain relief, they were mutilated, they gave birth shackled to beds with pillows and blankets held on their faces to stop them seeing their babies. The thinking being, clean break, she won't bond. If she doesn't see the baby, she won't bond with the baby. They never stopped grieving.
And we know now how important it is for babies to have that skin-on-skin, immediate contact with their mothers. So the psychological injuries to those new babies is incalculable. We'll never know.
They already knew that. I think that's the most upsetting thing for me. They already knew the damage from the war babies. They already knew the importance of skin-to-skin contact, early bonding, the importance of mother's milk, suckling a baby, feeding and bonding with a baby. And they weren't allowed to even see their baby, let alone hold or feed their baby. So, one woman described having so much milk. She was a married woman, because married women were also given still bistro, but they knew they were being given it and they had a choice. Whereas these young girls were just overdosed on it.
Why was it given to the married women? What was the purpose?
It was given in cases where women made way too much breast milk. They just had an overload.
Wow.
And this one woman described making an overload of breast milk for her baby, and she asked for medication to stop it, so not realising what the damage was. So she took this drug and still made too much breast milk. So she then express milk, which was given to the prem babies in the nursery. Now, the likelihood would be these were the babies, like Lily's baby, that weren't being nurtured and suckled. They would have been given that milk.
Because they weren't allowed to produce milk for their own babies.
they weren't allowed to. So they would first shot in the arm in the delivery room and then dosed with tablets, and in Lily's case, sent home with tablets, most were, to make the milk go away. But it lingers in the system. So even though it was said at the Western Australian parliamentary inquiry last year that it had a short shelf life, it didn't impact unmarried women. It only impacted married women, because it originally was introduced as an anti-miscarriage drug. So they were trialling it on women to prevent miscarriage, married women, early on in the 40s and 50s, until they discovered that it was causing rare vaginal cancers in the babies that had been exposed to it in utero, and that women who were given it, married women, had a 3 times greater risk of breast cancer. So they knew all that, but they carried on giving it to unmarried women in huge quantities. The dosage was shocking, and that was produced to the parliamentary inquiry, sometimes up to 3 times the amount that married women had been given.
The sheer number of crimes that we're talking about is unfathomable. The number of crimes committed in every institution on a daily basis, is hard to fathom. How and why did it stop? How did this end in the late 80s?
Well, it sort of started to grind to a halt, because I've spoken with adoptees too, and, they're victims of this crime too.
Yeah.
And they don't know the medical history. Well, many of them never found their families. But it stopped because the introduction of the contraceptive pill meant that women had a choice over their own bodies. Termination became legalised.
Surely the increase in education as well. I was in high school in the 80s, and we had sex education. We had it in primary school.
Yes, it was so, but it dried up the supply of babies for adoption. And there were stories in the paper with MPs complaining that there were a shortage of babies for adoption. In New South Wales, they had a God machine. I don't know if you've heard of the God machine.
No.
I managed to find the advert for it. It's shocking. It's got 2 nurses smiling by this machine. It's like a tax machine. It's like a lottery machine. So the babies were being produced to order. So you could say, and in 1972, the ideal baby was a blonde, blue-eyed baby girl. So they had to go, all right, we've now got a glut of, an overload of baby boys in children's homes, because nobody wants a baby boy. They've already had a baby boy and adopted a baby boy. Now they want a little sister. So little baby girls were in great demand in 72. So you could really say, look, I'd like a baby that looks like us. I'd like a blue-eyed, blonde-haired baby girl, intelligent. So if your partner and you have got a good education, well, that baby was in demand. But you fed it into the machine spun around, and it spat out the perfect designer child for your nuclear family.
Wow.
And that was still going in the 70s. So then they introduced contraceptive pill, and then termination is legalised, and slowly the supply starts to dry up.
I do remember an attitude that it was such a shame there weren't many babies for adoption anymore. I remember a person in my family who was my parents' age, was infertile, desperate to adopt, and the whole family talking about it for years and years and years. This would be late 70s, early 80s, how it's such a tragedy that it's so hard to adopt now, without ever considering where all those babies came from.
Exactly. And what mother really wants to give her child up, her newborn baby, for adoption?
Very few.
So when you think there were 250,000 adoptions in Australia in the years from 1950 to 1989, 150,000 we know are forced adoption, but that's got to be a conservative figure. Like, it's got to be. Look, Lily's organisation Origins fought very, very hard for a national apology after the Indigenous apology, the Stolen Generation, and after the Forgotten Australians, the little kids that were brought out, migrant kids put in institutions and abused. So you've got 2 national apologies hot on the heels of each other. And Lily's organisation fought for the national apology, which Julia Gillard gave in 2012. And I listened to it the other day. It's a really profound, sincere apology, which Professor Nahum Mushin wrote. He wrote that apology. Right. And he said he consulted with the various organisations, and one of the big beefs that Lily had was it must say that this was illegal.
Yes.
they had no found basis in law to do it.
We say sorry to you, the mothers, who were denied knowledge of your rights, which meant you could not provide informed consent. You were given false assurances. You were forced to endure the coercion and brutality of practices that were unethical, dishonest, and in many cases illegal.
Without the word illegal, it wasn't worth the paper it was written on. And he was very strict about that, and he made sure it said that this was an illegal practice. You know, she's now taken her case. Her fight has gone to Geneva, to the Human Rights Commissioner, the High Commission for Human Rights, where they're arguing because there's no restitution for these women. There's been no compensation. And I have to say, it'd probably be the only victims of a crime, a terrible crime, that I have covered where there's been no compensation, no crimes comp. So she's taken this case arguing that it's a mass violation of an entire generation of women and children's human rights in Australia. The rest of the world are watching that. Because if we win that compensation, it opens the floodgates in Canada, in the UK, in New Zealand. The New Zealand women, they haven't had an apology yet. They're still waiting for an apology. They're lobbying. In the UK, they're lobbying like crazy at the moment for an apology. Meanwhile, in Queensland, it's being touted that adoption should be reintroduced to stamp out youth crime. Well, we know for a fact with the adoptees, it's caused identity issues, drug and alcoholisms, high suicides and crime.
But do they mean some level of forced adoption? Because adoption is not illegal. Any woman has the right to, give up her child for adoption.
Well, they're sort of seeing it as a solution to rising youth crime in Queensland. It's being touted as putting something in place.
How bizarre.
That has sent the women I deal with into the biggest panic.
Oh, yeah.
Because they all know
what that really means.
What that means. Lily, I recently went to a family barbecue at her place, and her son that was adopted against her will came with his family, and it was the most surreal thing to sit there and watch this young guy in his 40s with his kids and his wife mixing with the sister he's now getting to know, the half-sister he's getting to know. His biological father was there with his family, because Lily and her partner never married, it wrecked the relationship. And there's all these blended families with grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But his children have no sense of their heritage.
At least they do know each other, and they have been able to keep positive relationships, because obviously we know, Lily and the father of the baby, in inverted commas, have managed to, stay in touch, keep a relationship, although not romantic. How rare is that? How rare is the happy ending, I'll say, that Lily's having?
Very. I found one for the 60 Minutes show.
Coming up,
2 policemen walked into my home in the middle of the night.
forced to give up their babies because they weren't married.
She said, either you sign or you'll be here forever.
Then drugged in a cruel medical scandal.
The drug was too carcinogenic for chickens.
They're saying it didn't happen. It didn't affect married women or their offspring. Well, how do they know if they've done no research? That's our argument. How can you possibly say that unless you do the research? We're calling, Origins are calling for greater research into the long-term impact of that drug on younger, they're now elderly women, once younger married women, and their children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
Lily's grandchildren have got medical issues too. So it's to generate intergenerational crime. And the women in my memoir group who we've become very tight, we've got the stories that come out of that group. I've got a new woman who's a lovely, lovely woman, and she grew up an only child adopted until she found out she was one of about 9 kids. And she was like baby number 4 to be taken off her mother. And she's got a whole other family that she spent all her life, her adult life, tracking down. So these stories go on, and some have established relationships, most haven't, And also, like Mushin says, the conflict for the adoptee is between the parents that have brought them up. They owe them loyalty and love, and the mother and father they never knew. And they're told, oh, she didn't want you. They're nearly all told, your mother didn't want you. She gave you away. And they've grown up believing that.
So they grow up thinking that their biological mother is a villain,
Yeah.
to put it simply.
Promiscuous.
Right, all of those things, and that it's her fault that this all happened. But then there must be a sense when they learn about the reality of how this all happened, is there a sense that their adoptive parents were complicit in this conspiracy?
For some, I don't think so. But it leaves you wondering who the hell you are, doesn't it? Who am I? That's what the lady said who discovered she got this great big family. She said, I found this piece of paper with my name on, but it wasn't my name. And it said on the top, adopted. That's how she found out she was adopted. And she felt sorry for her adoptive mother who had wanted to tell her, but was repeatedly told not to by the social services. To do not tell her, you'll damage her for life. So she's doing what she thinks is the right thing.
Well, that's what I was thinking too. I mean, I don't think on any level it's fair to villainise the adoptive parents, because I think they were victims to some extent as well, because they were being told that they were doing an angelic, amazing thing, rescuing, saving a baby. And I know I've read that about adoptees as well, that they sort of feel this weird feeling of growing up like they were rescued, like they owe their parents this eternal gratitude. That's a weird dynamic as well, can be.
Totally, because one of my women at the writing group is an adoptee, and she's so conflicted with that, because whilst the general attitude of people, you're so lucky, like because you were adopted, you're so lucky, your parents are so good. Her father was, but her adopted mother was very mentally unstable, and she was punished. So for a lot of I've spoken to a number of adoptees who've said they felt they were punished for whichever parent couldn't have the child, was infertile, punished her. The adopted child is punished for all the shortcomings that they feel themselves, the adopted family feels themselves. And they get caught up in, because people whose marriages were in trouble, which Jeffrey Rickaby, the psychiatrist, was counselling these couples who'd adopted a child and thought it was all hunky-dory, till the child hits puberty. And you've got, on top of adolescence, you've got this loss of identity that you're dealing with, a really conflicted kid with damage. And they were like, what have we done?
Oh, how awful.
Look, I've heard absolute horror stories of adoptees tracking down original mothers and abusing them physically, or stealing money off them or whatever. Look, I worked for women's magazines, as you know, and I remember once doing 100 years of New Idea or one of the mags, and going through all the old archives where they had lovely pictures of happy, smiling families, and look at these wonderful Christian people who've adopted this poor little girl that nobody wants. And that was the myth that was we were helping that in women's magazines, controlling the narrative. And that wasn't how it was. Some of those adoptees went into homes that were highly dysfunctional and sexually very abusive.
Yeah. You also talked to a woman on your podcast, Rosalie, am I right in saying that Rosalie's mum was not infertile? She actually had 2 daughters. Rosalie was one of them, but then decided that she wanted a son, so she adopted one. So again, that's a spanner in the works of these fabulous families who are infertile and God wants them to have babies and all that.
Yeah, that was her story really interested me, because she had seen firsthand as a very little girl of about 3 or 4. She remembers very clearly going to the next door neighbour with her sister and then being brought home, and the neighbour says, Mum's got a surprise for you. So she goes in and there's Mum bathing this little baby in the kitchen.
Like it's a puppy.
Yeah, in a baby bath. And Rosie said they'd never seen a little boy before, and they were only very little, her and her sister. And they lean over and look at the baby boy who Mum's bathing, lovingly bathing, and he wees in the bath. And she's like, I always remembered that he weed everywhere. And it was a real big thing for her. And but then Mum said the next day she didn't like him. So he got to go back.
No.
Yeah, I'm going to take him back to the hospital. Because you could try them, see. It's a bit like taking a dog home from the dog's home, and if it doesn't figure out, and take it back. So Mum decided to take him back for whatever reason. She took him back. And then he had eczema, and she didn't like that. And so she took him back and got a girl baby, brought the girl home. So then they're called in. That one's gone. We've got another one now, got a little girl. What do you think of her? And they thought she was lovely. And she was mixed race. And then Mum decided that she'd got long legs and big feet and might be a very tall, horsey woman when she grows up. So Mum said, I'm going to take her back too, and I'll have a different one. And at that stage, the nurse at the hospital said, you're not having any more from here.
Thank God.
But Rosalie's dad worked for social services, Centrelink, whatever they called it at the time. So he knew the mums coming through that were pregnant. So he was able to earmark a baby for them before the baby was born.
Oh, because he could see the mother and have a bit of an idea of how the baby might come out.
Yeah. So she did have 2 more adopted children in the family. But it was like, take it home and try it out and see if you like it or not.
It goes to show how many babies were available, doesn't it? I mean, as I say, by the time I was around, it was like an adoptive baby was like hen's teeth.
Exactly.
But obviously, there were plenty around.
But there were, but for Lily, the year she had her baby boy, in 1967, there was a lot of demand for baby boys. So, he was easy to place. But then when she had her daughter Amanda in 1972, 5 years later, so she has Amanda, what everyone wanted, because they'd adopted baby boys, was a blue-eyed baby girl. And Lily didn't know, but her second baby, Amanda, was taken away, and she was asking to see the baby all the time. Where's my baby? And eventually she was then married someone else, and her husband came in as demanded, where is her baby? She has not seen her baby in 4 days. And when the baby was brought down from the ward at Crown Street Hospital in Sydney, which was notorious, it was marked for adoption. So they tried to take a second baby off her.
She was married.
She was married.
Everything by then.
She'd already had a baby taken for being unfit. So they thought they could get away with it a second time.
Oh,
yes.
That's unbelievable.
So they then changed the rules to sort of get rid of the surplus of baby boys. They said, right, you can have your girl next time, but you've got to have 2 baby boys first or 1 baby boy first.
Imagine how that worked out in a lot of cases, being forced to take a baby boy.
The one you didn't want.
Yeah.
It's a big, huge story, and we're still very active at the moment. We are asking for anyone that's listening to this podcast whose baby was taken from them, who recalls being given a drug to dry up their milk. It would have been still bistro. That was the drug of choice. We'd like to hear from them. Origins would like to hear from them, because we're doing a survey to try and get enough people to determine which we're calling for medical research to be done into the long-term health of these women.
Now, tell us about Origins. Tell us about the work that Origins does. Is this a national group?
Well, it's an international organisation.
Okay.
And it supports people. It's called Origins Australia, supporting people separated by adoption. They offer help in tracking down, if you're trying to find your mother that you've never met, or you're trying to find siblings, or you're trying to find someone they can help there. They offer counselling support. They offer, I think the best, what all my women say, the best support they've ever had was meeting other people who understood it's like any support group.
Because they were pushed into secrecy and isolation about it. I imagine that would be incredibly liberating to be able to meet other people and talk about it.
And share it. The lady the newcomer to our memoir group was really sort of anxious about how that would be for her. And she gave me her first chapter that she'd written something like 12 years ago. And she said, look, it's probably too old by now, and it probably doesn't apply anymore. But I thought I'd show you what I'd written. And it was amazing. It's as relevant today. And I said, your experience of what happened to you hasn't changed. The climate around you may have.
Yeah, this is very sexist, but I'm going to say, looking at the website, this is unmistakably an organisation run by women.
Yeah.
Because it's so communicative. It's like there are tabs, known mental health damage, founder of Origins, inquiries, you can access and read the inquiries, you can read documents. There's information about that drug, which I won't try to pronounce. How do you pronounce it?
We call it DES, but it's diethylstilbistro. But we're doing a survey. It's on the website, and we're trying to get as many people as we can to, and not just here in Australia, but we're getting a lot of inquiries from Canada. Lilyfield's calls every day from the UK. We've had the BBC on the phone. We've had ITV on the phone. They're doing a big push over there, given what we've done, especially since 60 Minutes ran their show. It's created a lot of interest in the UK because they're really upping the ante there for a national apology, which doesn't look like they're going to get. But we're calling for compensation. Look, there has been piecemeal compensation in Victoria, where they're asking women whose babies were taken to contact them, and they're looking at paying small amounts to those women. But it's very piecemeal, and it's not across the board, and it should be for every victim of that crime.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm really clear about that being a crime, because
I think it's dozens of crimes committed by hundreds of people.
it's an atrocity, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think that for me, seeing Lily's book on a shelf under bio, I'm thinking, hang on a minute, that needs to be under true crime. It's probably one of the most horrific, little-known true crimes. There is a sorry day for First Nations people. There is a place in history for the forgotten Australians. We now know about that case. There is no school curriculum that teaches about forced adoption.
And yet, as we've said, we are no doubt surrounded by people affected by these crimes who probably have never spoken of it, a lot of them, who've lived with this heartache.
All their lives.
Yeah.
Well, and a lot of men too, because I do a lot of talks for Rotary and places like that, talking about my murder books. And I always introduce this subject now, forced adoption. Every single time I have done so, someone comes up to me at the end and says, my husband had a baby that he wasn't allowed to see, and the mother gave it away. I think the mother didn't give it away. No. She wouldn't have given it away. Very few women gave their babies away.
Lily is one person who had two fantastic male partners who wanted to have the baby with her. And the first one, their baby was stolen. And the second one had to fight for their baby not to be stolen. So there's definitely a lot of men victimised by this as well, not to mention the adopted boys.
And actually, Professor Mushin said that to me. He said, I'm a doting grandfather. I can't imagine being denied an opportunity to know my own grandchild as a grandfather. And there are many heartbroken grandparents out there too who felt they didn't try hard enough. That some of them did try. Rosalie's mother tried. Rosalie's mother actually offered to adopt the baby and raise it as their own, but the authorities wouldn't allow it because the baby was earmarked for other people.
And because there'd be no money in it going to the grandma, which again is reflected in the stolen generations. We know there were many family members who wanted to keep kinship care, and to be honest, there still are. That is an ongoing issue. So this is why I say to you, it just to me opens this window of this habit we have, this terrible habit we have of stealing people's babies.
And that's why I felt that this was worth a podcast. There are women in my group who are having a go at writing their own memoir, but there are women for who it is too painful and don't want to have to revisit that part of their life by raking it over and writing about it. And I thought, well, a podcast would be a wonderful platform where they can chat in a comfortable environment, share their story as they see fit, and it may encourage other people to come forward. So that is what's happened. That is what's happened.
And your partnership with Origins, I think, is really important so that, again, women, men, people who are part of this and who didn't know that there was support, letting them know that there is this organisation and that it has lots of offshoots, lots of support is really great.
Well, we do get calls from fathers, from adoptees, male adoptees. There's quite a few. And also Moira Major has been fantastic. This has been a fantastic collaboration with Moira because, she's the mother of two boys as well. And she said to me, I used to be her neighbour because I lived over the road. I was the idiot woman writing on my laptop at like midnight and she didn't know what I was doing. What are you doing at midnight writing on your ironing board? I'm sitting in the window writing. And she said, what are you doing now? And I told her and she went, oh, so she became very interested in the subject too. And I said, I think we should do a podcast.
It's a great collaboration. Moira is a radio announcer of many years' experience. She's an excellent operator in radio on the Goldie.
Yes, she is.
And you're a great partnership. It's fantastic. Congratulations. Please pass that on to Moira.
I will. Thank you.
As I say, it's you at the peak of your powers, which are substantial, your powers. I look forward to, will you do another series, do you think?
Yeah, we definitely will.
Great.
Because we've only touched the surface, we've scratched the surface, but we've got dads who want to talk, grandparents with awful stories, and I think it does need to explore more. We had one adoptee speak, but there are many, many more with other stories. And then there are good luck stories too.
Yes, but we are at a place in history where women's rights are being targeted again, being challenged. And so I think the more we engage with this recent history and inform ourselves and each other of what can happen when women of any age are treated like they have no rights, they have no place, they have no value.
Yes.
You know, it's important for us to know. Thank you so much, Megan. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And please let's talk again when you have developments on any front.
Thank you.
Keep us updated.
Oh, no, we'd love to. And thank you very, very much for talking to us about this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you to our guest today, Megan Norris. You can find the podcast Somebody's Daughter wherever you get your podcasts. If you need support after listening to this podcast, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or contact 1800-RESPECT on 1800 737 732 or 1800respect.org.au. Indigenous Australians can contact 13 Yarn on 13 92 76 or 13yarn.org.au.
The producers of this podcast recognise the traditional owners of the land on which it's recorded. They pay respect to the Aboriginal elders past, present and those emerging.